We are continuing our series on It Takes Faith. And last week we talked about those three fellows, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that were thrown into that hot furnace and did not cook. And this week I'm going to talk to you guys about the den. I'm going to talk to you guys about the lion's den. Now, if you were raised in church, this is a familiar story, right? This is something that you've heard a lot, maybe something that you've done different projects or crafts on. I don't know how as Sunday school teachers we can kind of make it cute and fun to think about a bunch of ravenous lions in a den that's about to eat a man. It's not really that cute at all. But this morning, though, as we talk about this experience that Daniel went through, this thought comes to my mind. Despite present appearances, God is in control. Despite present appearances, God is in control. And that could be very, very hard to have the courage to believe in. Sometimes it appears as though by our experiences, it appears as though because of the things that are going on around us, it appears as so because of our personal difficulties, that God is not in control, that God is not that involved, but He is. In 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 10, it says this: "We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, Greek brothers, about trouble we went through in the province of Asia." This is Paul talking about travels to express the gospel. And he says this: "We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure, and we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die, but as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God, who raises the dead. And He did rescue us from mortal danger, and He will rescue us again. We have placed our confidence in Him, and He will continue to rescue us. He will continue to rescue us." Now, there was this serious, terrifying incident that took place in the book of Daniel, as it's expressed. You guys know the story. Just to give you guys a little bit of background here. At the end of chapter 5, Babylon was defeated by the Persians, and now Darius the Mede rules over Babylon. And Daniel, who is now over 80 years old, becomes one of Darius's favorite people. And some people did not like that at all. Some people didn't like that at all. Now, oh, darn you. Oh, well. My tablet's not responding correct. That's probably why I should have printed it. Anyway. So, in this struggle, in this situation, in this difficulty, Daniel finds himself in a den of lions. Now, we'll get to that part of the story in just a moment, but I want to show you guys a video clip, and I want you guys to consider or think about all the different noises that lions randomly make, even if the lions aren't necessarily seen as that dangerous, okay? Go ahead, you guys can go ahead and shoot to the next clip there. That was yawning. This is kind of cute, actually. even know what he's doing. It's just like, yeah, something like that. See you later. Okay. You can jump back to the clip before this one. So we've got Daniel that had faith before the lion's den. And so just to give you guys a snapshot of what is happening, you could read through the entire chapter 6 of the book of Daniel to see the story as a whole. But Darius the Mede decided, this is in verse 1, and I'll get to that in just a second, but Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces and appointed a prince to rule over each province. And the king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the princes and to watch out for the king's interests. All right, so Daniel was the guy. Daniel was seen as somebody very popular, very special, and there were other advisors, other leaders, other people that were involved that were not okay with this. They were very, very jealous. All right. In verse 3, it says that Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. This is a man who has been exiled from his homeland. This is a man who's been placed in a situation where they were trying to convince him to worship other gods. And he stayed committed. He stayed focused. He stayed connected to the God of the Bible, the God, the Lord of all lords, the King of all kings. And in spite of all of that, if you read the book of Daniel, it's an interesting book with lots of prophecies, but Daniel gives some very, very drop in the hammer kind of messages to those who are in leadership, messages that were not comfortable, messages that were of disaster coming. And he still found himself in a place of great leadership and power. And they didn't like that. They were uncomfortable. So just kind of breaking it down a little bit, they went after him. They started trying to find different things to accuse him of. Now, Daniel's character spoke for itself. Daniel was a man who had incredible character. And so he would, as they started to try to, gather and conspire, they weren't able to gather or conspire anything against him. And so the story goes on. They decide essentially that they are going to do something. They're going to stroke the king's ego. They're going to convince the king to sign a decree into law. And in signing that decree into law, they will be able to cause Daniel to be killed in the lion's den because Daniel refused to not pray. He refused to stop praying. He refused to stop believing and to stop kneeling 3 times a day and calling out to God. And so they stroked the king's ego, and then going on in verse 11, then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying. All right, so they convinced him to do this. All right, they go to him in verse 6. They're like, long live the King Darius, we are all in agreement. We administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. For the next 30 days, no person prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, or they'll be thrown in the lion's den. Now, your majesty, I can just imagine this, issue this and sign this law so it cannot be changed, the official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. Man, I could just imagine their delight. They're thinking about this. We got him. This guy who thinks he's all that. This guy who this king is going to place in a position of authority. This guy that this king has great plans for, who thought that, they thought we can't get anything, we can't pull anything up to address him or to cause problems for him. So, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make a law that will cause a predicament. And it happened. He still prays. In verse 13, they told him he still prays to his God 3 times a day. And the king, if you go up just a little bit, the king essentially said that decision still stands. It is official law of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be revoked. And then in verse 14 it says, hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. This king was upset. These officials were excited. They had come up with this brilliant idea to end this man's life. And the king was like, I got to come up with something. I've got to figure something out. I've got to try to find a loophole in it. But there was no loophole to find. And so he was troubled. He was having a serious challenge. And then in verse 16, it goes on to say, all right, so he couldn't find anything to exonerate Daniel. So at last the king orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown in the lion's den. And this is what the king said to him. He said, may your God, whom you worship continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel from the lions. And the king returned to the palace and spent the night fasting. Whoa. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Can you imagine that? Pagan king, so in turmoil over what was happening that he chose to fast. I'm sure because he was a king, there were lavish meals prepared for him. And he chose not to eat. He chose to refuse the food. He fasted all night, and he actually prayed for this man to be rescued. He prayed that God would release him. Verse 19, early the next morning, the king hurried out to the lion's den. And when he got there, he called out in anguish. Oh man, that's suffering. That's fear, that's terror. He was so overwhelmed with this righteous man being killed like this. The king got there. Imagine the anguished voice. Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God whom you worship continually able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel answered, long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed. He was excited. He lifted him out of the den. Not a scratch was found. Just in the earlier story, there was not a singe or a burn mark on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Not a single scratch was found on this man. And, it's awful, but in verse 24, it says, the king gave orders, arrested the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown in the lion's den. The Bible's not always so pretty, along with their wives and children. That's awful. But he was not a nice king, okay? Just saying. The lions, this is ugly too. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor. They were probably hungry because they didn't eat the meal that was prepared for them just the night before. That is not funny. And then the king Darius sent out his message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. And he says this. He says, peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout the kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel, for he is a living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I want you to think of this phrase right here. In every human struggle that we are confronted with, you got to answer this question. Because God is faithful. And then fill it in. Because God is faithful. Because God is faithful. For Daniel, because God is faithful, the lions did not even scratch him. Because God is faithful, he faced this situation with courage and was brought out the next day unharmed. Because God is faithful. Here's some. I'm going to take this story. I'm going to give you guys some credible examples as to what happens when God is faithful. When God is faithful, conspiring won't succeed. When God is faithful, conspiring won't succeed. In their jealousy, they conspired to personally destroy him, but could not. They didn't have anything. They desired to ruin him. They wanted to destroy his character. Their jealousy had driven them to cause him suffering by going to the king and saying, he did this or he did that. But they could find nothing to dig up on him. There was no dirt. There was nothing they could do. A great leader once told me this. Sometimes the best advice is this. There are times when you need to just step back and let your character speak for itself. You know, a lot of Christians today are raising this banner saying, I this and I that, and we feel like we've got so much to prove, but sometimes the best decision that will prove the most is just to step back and say, you know what, I'm not going to fight this. I'm going to let my integrity and who I am in God, even imperfect, prove my credibility. Prove that I serve God. If people were to be given an opportunity, they found him bowing and praying to God in a window. If people were given a window into your life, what would they see? What would they take notice of? What would they recognize? Would they see unwavering faith? And because, here's another thought here, okay? The conspiring won't succeed. Because God is faithful, we can trust him with our ruins. Daniel trusted God with the ruins of his home. Why was he praying towards Jerusalem? Because of what had just happened there. They were invaded. Their home was destroyed. Their temple was torn down, and they were exiled. They were taken to this foreign land. And I imagine that Daniel, as he prayed, he wept that God would restore the ruins of his people. When God is faithful, I imagine, I'm not 100% certain, but I imagine that Daniel wasn't bowing 3 times a day saying, okay, God, rescue me from the lions. He wasn't concerned about that. He was concerned about his homeland. He was concerned about God's chosen people. He was concerned about things that had happened to him and his people, and that God would restore the ruins. We've got to set our heart on what is broken and trust that God can breathe new life back into it. If you were to be the fixation of an enemy's attack, would hope be present? Or would it be focused on that alone? Because God is faithful, we can trust him with our ruins. We can trust him with the things that have caved in on our lives. We can trust him with all the difficulties that we face, whether they're our faults or not. We can trust him with the shambles that is that has fallen apart as a result of our families falling apart. We can trust him with whatever ruins we face. We can trust him with financial difficulties. We can trust him with our marriages. We can trust him with our family, our relationships with our parents, our relationships with our children. We can trust him as Daniel trusted him with his ruins. Because God is faithful, we can pray for rescue in the face of doubt. Now, I want you to think about this for just a minute, okay? I'm not talking about Daniel and doubt. I'm talking about the king. I'm talking about the king. The king, as the scripture defined, was anguished. The king was anguished. The king had to follow his own ruling. He had been manipulated into making a decision he shouldn't have made. And because of that, his favorite was thrown in a den of lions. However, this king fought for hope in the face of doubt. The officials had glee. He was overwhelmed. And what does he do? The king doesn't step back and say, oh, God, I hope that. No. He breaks from his own personal religious tradition. He doesn't go home and do what he normally does. No, he fasts. He decides, I'm going to follow suit. You know, when these exiled people were brought to their land, they try to feed them food that was offered to their pagan gods. And these boys that were exiled over, they refused to eat of this food as a statement of their worship of God. And it didn't kill them. They were respectful of the king. I'm sure that this king had heard stories about that happening. And he's like, okay, man, this guy means so much to me. Maybe God will rescue him. I'm sure he'd heard stories about those 3 fellas thrown into a fiery furnace. I wonder if God will rescue him. You know what? I'm going to pray. I'm going to fast. He was up all night. The penalty for the disobedience was a horrifying death in the den of ravenous lions. Because God is faithful, we will make it through the darkest night. We will make it through the darkest night. All right, they're in a den, and it is sealed. You ever been in pitch black? It's scary. The sound of nothing can be terrifying. Now, this is the thing. This is why I showed you this video clip, okay? It wasn't quiet. You imagine like sitting down there like, okay, God, I'm in this dark hole, and then you hear like a lion next to you just like up and yawn, and you're just like, whoa. I mean, can you imagine like for a second, like you know, they didn't scratch him, but I'm sure it was kind of close quarters there. Can you imagine like you're sitting there and you're praying like I can't see anything, and all of a sudden you smell the stench of a lion's breath? You're like, oh man, he's close. You know, he's really close. All right? Now, I imagine these lions were hungry too, because their purpose was to eat whatever was thrown in there, so they probably weren't fed very well. Just imagine for a second the lion's stomach rumbling because it's hungry. You know what I'm saying? You know? He's in this den, and it's dark. It's pitch black. And he could hear the lions yawn. He could hear the lions lick their lips when their mouths were dry. He could hear everything. Could he hear the lions communicating to each other? Like the video I showed you, that lion wasn't like roaring loud. You know, he was just kind of like, you know, I don't know what he was doing. But can you imagine being in a black hole where you can't see anything and hearing that? I love this statement. What is true in the light is still true in the dark. What is true in the light is still true in the dark. God is in the sound of silence. God is near in our darkest of moments. You see, God will get us through. God will get us through. It doesn't matter where we've been thrown into. It doesn't matter what circumstance we are facing. And it may not be like this. This man, he made it through without a scratch. You may make it through your situations without a scratch, but there are times in your life where you don't escape this, whatever it is that you're facing, without some suffering. And that happens. The three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into a furnace, and they said to that king, God will rescue us, but even if he doesn't. I imagine that Daniel felt the same way. Even if I'm eaten tonight, I will go to my death confident that perhaps his example would lead. Perhaps his decision to pray anyway would show others that he decided that his faith was more important to him than any decree that any king would ever make. You see, what is true in the light is still true in the dark. And because God is faithful, joy comes in the morning. Daniel was exonerated. And not only was he exonerated, he thrived, he flourished, and God was praised. This worked as a catapult. The king had already had plans for him. The king had already decided to do some things with him. But when this man made it through the night in a lion's den and came out unharmed, the king not only set him in authority and leadership, but he sent a decree out and said, this God is God. And you worship him. And you worship him alone. Psalm 30, verse 5, weeping may last through the night, but joy comes with the morning. And there are several players in this story. I'm not talking about Daniel alone. I mean, I'm sure that when he heard the king's voice and he shouted out, he was full of glee. I made it through the night. And when that stone began to roll away and the light began to push in through that darkness, in that morning, the king was full of delight. The king was full of joy. His mourning was through the night. The king's weeping was through the night. The king had fasted and prayed for this man to survive. I'm sure that Daniel was in the lion's den praying that God would protect him and keep him safe. And this moment catapulted Daniel into the light. God's brilliance is inescapable. This miracle won favor with the king. In Psalm 73:26, my health may fail and my spirit may grow weak, but God remains the strength of my heart. He is mine forever. If Daniel was never thrown in the lion's den, the king would have never cried out to God. Think about it. If Daniel was never caught in this. You see, these officials and leaders thought they had duped the king and thought they had come up with this mighty plan, but God had already knew it was going to happen, and God had already orchestrated some things and put some things together that he knew that the way to bring this king to his knees was to throw his servant into the den, knowing that he would protect him. As Jesus began his ministry, he made this statement. In Matthew 4:16, he says, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who lived in the land where death casts its shadow, a light has shined. Daniel was in the den for a night. Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days. It looked as though the enemy had succeeded, and Jesus was sealed in. They thought that they had overcome this man who claimed to be the Son of God, and it was all a part of God's design in the first place. And it would make like that king who cried out to God like he never would have unless someone was thrown into that den. It has made people who would have nothing to do with God drop to their knees and cry out because they know I know. I've experienced him. The man who laid in a tomb for 3 days and broke free. Nothing was able to silence him. What is true in the light is still true in the dark. In every human struggle that we are confronted with, we can say, because God is faithful, I will trust in the God who has the power to shut the mouths of lions. I will trust in him. I will be confident in him. I will know that he is mighty and in control. And so this morning, I want you to think about that phrase, because God is faithful. What is it for you? What is it? Is it a transition? Is it a move? Is it a relationship? It is a change in your soul. Is it letting something go? Is it holding on to something you need to? What is it? You got to ask yourself. You got to be boldly honest. These points that I made for you was just to establish the reality that Daniel trusted in God in every moment. And we too can trust in God in every moment. A powerful God. A God who sent his son Jesus for our rescue. A God who has the ability to raise the dead. And you see that death that casts its shadow, that death that has cast a shadow. When light hits darkness, darkness has no power. It's gone. It is gone. Because God is faithful. Answer that question. Father, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for your sustaining grace to help me to share this today. God, because God is faithful, because you are faithful. God, because you are faithful, I'm going to trust right now that I will be well by the end of the day. Because, God, you are faithful, we are going to trust that you are going to handle our finances as we trust you with them. God, because you are faithful, we are going to trust that you will restore that relationship. Because you are faithful, we are going to trust that you will exonerate us from the enemy's voices that attempt to destroy our character. Because you are faithful, God, we are going to trust that even in the darkest of nights, that the things you told us in the light are still true. Because you are faithful, God, we are going to fast, and we are going to pray, and we are going to trust. Because you are faithful. God, may we fill in the answer to that question in our own life, and we would hold on more tightly than we have ever held on before, and we would be awed by what you did, and that we would share it, that we would say it. Ultimately, because you are faithful, God, you sent your Son, and you freed us from our sin so that we could be in heaven with you. Because you are faithful. Amen.